Moving into the old house felt like walking into a painting that had started to peel away at the edges. It was the kind of place you might see on a postcard, all grandeur and grace, but once inside, the cracks showed themselves. My husband had fallen in love with the sprawling gardens and arched windows. For me, it was the promise of a new beginning after the most tumultuous year of my life. The house had belonged to a distant relative on my husband's side, left to him through a will so outdated it felt like a relic itself. We saw it as a gift or perhaps a challenge. Our two children were fascinated by its labyrinth of rooms, the high ceilings, the narrow staircases that creaked with every step. To them, it was an adventure. To me, it was something else entirely. As we settled in, I tried to overlook the discomfort that kept building in my chest. The house felt too quiet, even when the kids were running up and down the halls, their laughter echoing off the old plaster walls. There was a heaviness about the place, something that pressed down on me in the stillness of the night. But I ignored it, attributing it to the stress of moving, of starting over. Days turned into weeks, and life found its rhythm. The kids began school. My husband busied himself with work, and I occupied my time with unpacking, organizing, and exploring the house's dusty corners. It was during one of those afternoons, while sorting through a storage room on the third floor, that I found the chest. It was small and made of dark wood, with tarnished brass hinges that resisted my attempts to pry it open. I left it there for the time being, thinking it a project for another day. But my curiosity simmered beneath the surface, as if the chest itself had whispered an invitation. The following morning, I returned to the room with a screwdriver, determined to coax the lid open. It gave way with a groan, the sound sharp and hollow in the otherwise silent room. Inside, I found a collection of old letters, bound with faded ribbon, their pages fragile with age. Reading those letters felt like trespassing into someone else's grief. They told a story of love and betrayal, of promises made and broken. The handwriting was elegant but strained, the ink blotched in places where tears had once fallen. I couldn't help but feel the intensity of those words, as if the emotions that had poured onto the paper remained there, suspended in time. I spent hours that day, poring over the letters, piecing together fragments of a life long forgotten. What disturbed me most wasn't the sadness or even the anger threaded through those pages. It was the lingering sense of unfinished business, as though the writer had been trying to convey something they never managed to put into words. From that day on, the chest became my obsession. I couldn't explain it to my husband, couldn't justify why I felt compelled to read every letter, to sort them chronologically, to analyze the relationships hinted at but never fully revealed. The letters haunted me, their voices merging with the creaks and groans of the old house. The more I read, the more I began to sense a pattern, a thread connecting the past to the present. And the more I delved into those letters, the more the house itself seemed to respond. Doors would stick for no reason, lights would flicker without warning, and the air would grow thick and heavy whenever I lingered over a particular passage. It was as if the house was trying to communicate, urging me to uncover what had been buried for so long. And I was determined to listen. But even then, I had no idea how deep the secrets ran, or how much they would change everything I thought I knew about my own life. The discovery of the letters transformed my days. I woke up with a strange urgency, like I was supposed to be somewhere, doing something vital. My husband laughed it off as another of my peculiar hobbies, but he didn't understand the pull I felt. It was like an invisible thread tied me to that chest, drawing me back to it over and over again. I began to organize the letters, laying them out on the floor of the attic room where I'd found them. They were written over the span of a decade, from what I could piece together. The handwriting grew shakier with each passing year, the tone shifting from hopeful to desperate. They spoke of loneliness, of betrayal, and of a love that had curdled into something darker. The woman who wrote them had lived in this house, that much was clear. Her name was Eleanor, and she wrote to a man named Samuel. But the letters weren't sent. They were confessions, laments, pleas left unsent and unread. I found myself thinking of Eleanor as if I knew her, my imagination filling in the gaps her words left behind. I couldn't help but feel a kinship with her. She had been trapped here, her words echoing through the empty rooms, lost and unheard. As the days passed, I felt her presence more acutely. It wasn't a ghost in the traditional sense, more like a lingering sadness, a sorrow that seeped into the air. It was around this time that the strange occurrences began to intensify. Objects would be out of place, the air would grow cold for no reason, and the children complained of bad dreams. My husband dismissed it all as coincidence, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. One evening, I was sorting through the final stack of letters when I noticed a single sheet of paper that had slipped beneath the chest itself. It was smaller, the ink smudged and faded almost beyond recognition, but I could still make out the words scrawled across the page. They were desperate, fragmented sentences, written in a hand that trembled with either rage or terror. The words spoke of betrayal and revenge, of promises broken and wounds that would not heal. Eleanor's anger burned through the page, and as I read, I felt something stir within the house itself. The air grew thick and oppressive, the silence deepening until it became almost deafening. That night I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house, wondering if Eleanor's rage was still festering within these walls. The rational part of me insisted it was all in my head, a product of too many hours spent reading the anguished words of a woman long dead. But another part of me couldn't shake the feeling that Eleanor's story was not finished. My obsession with the letters began to bleed into other areas of my life. I found myself neglecting household chores, forgetting errands, losing track of time. My husband grew frustrated with me, his patience wearing thin. He didn't understand why I couldn't just leave the past where it belonged. But I couldn't. Something was calling to me, something that demanded resolution. I had begun to dream of Eleanor, her face blurred and indistinct, her voice a whisper that tugged at my consciousness. She was trying to tell me something, of that I was certain. The children sensed my distraction. They grew quieter, their laughter subdued, their playful energy dampened by the tension that had settled over the house. I hated myself for letting it affect them, but I couldn't stop. I needed to understand. I started to dig deeper into the history of the house, scouring old documents and records. The more I learned, the more questions I uncovered. There were gaps, missing pieces that refused to fit into the puzzle I was trying to assemble. One evening, as I sat alone in the attic, the letters spread out before me like a map of someone else's suffering. I felt a presence behind me. It was a sensation so strong it raised the hairs on the back of my neck. I turned, expecting to find one of the children or my husband standing there. But the room was empty. For the first time, I wondered if perhaps I was losing my mind. But even as that thought crossed my mind, I knew I wouldn't stop. Whatever Eleanor had been trying to say, I would find out, no matter the cost. The more I read Eleanor's letters, the more I felt her pain merging with my own. Days blurred together, my mind wrapped in the mystery of her words. My husband's patience wore thin, his tone sharpening whenever I mentioned the letters. He couldn't understand the gravity of it, the way the words had sunk their claws into me. I found myself spending more time alone, my world narrowing to the dim light of the attic and the crackling paper between my fingers. I avoided my husband's questioning looks, the silent judgment I imagined in his eyes. He had grown weary of my obsession, of my constant retreat into the past. But I couldn't stop. The house began to feel smaller, its walls pressing in around me. The children grew restless, their playful energy fading into unease. I tried to shield them from the darkness I was uncovering, but it seeped into everything, staining the air with its heaviness. At night, I lay awake, listening to the creaks and groans of the old house, wondering if Eleanor's voice was whispering through the floorboards. One evening, after another argument with my husband over my fixation on the letters, I retreated to the attic. My hands trembled as I sifted through the papers, searching for answers that remained just out of reach. The air felt colder, the darkness deeper. I told myself it was only my imagination, but the feeling persisted. As I read, I began to notice something strange. Words that had once seemed disjointed and chaotic now formed a coherent narrative, as if Eleanor's story was unfolding before me. Her love for Samuel had been all-consuming, a devotion that bordered on obsession. But he had betrayed her, shattered her trust in ways that left her broken and vengeful. The letters grew darker, Eleanor's words sharpening into blades of resentment. I felt her anger, her grief, her desperation. She had been abandoned, left to rot within these very walls. And I was beginning to understand why her pain still lingered. But it wasn't just Eleanor's story that haunted me. As I read, I began to see echoes of my own life woven through her words. The loneliness, the feeling of being unheard, the creeping suspicion that I was losing myself. It was as if the house had chosen me to unravel its secrets, to bear the weight of its sorrow. I started to dream of Eleanor more frequently. In my dreams, she would stand at the foot of my bed, her figure shrouded in shadow. Her presence was neither threatening nor comforting. It was simply there, a constant reminder of the truth I was trying to uncover. One night, I awoke to the sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. My husband was asleep beside me, his breathing steady and oblivious. I lay still, my heart pounding, listening as the footsteps grew louder. They moved with purpose, as if searching for something, or someone. I rose from bed and followed the sound, my feet treading softly on the cold wooden floors. The house felt different in the dark, its familiar rooms twisted into something unfamiliar. The air was thick, the shadows deeper. I felt Eleanor's presence more acutely than ever before. The footsteps led me to the attic, where the letters lay scattered across the floor. As I entered the room, the air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. I knelt beside the chest, my fingers tracing the rough wood as if seeking guidance. Something compelled me to reach inside the chest once more. My hands closed around an object I hadn't noticed before, buried beneath the letters. It was a locket, tarnished and fragile. I opened it with trembling fingers, revealing a small portrait inside. A woman's face, her eyes sad and searching. I knew without doubt that it was Eleanor. The discovery of the locket only deepened my obsession. I spent hours staring at the portrait, wondering about the life she had lived, the pain she had endured. Her eyes seemed to follow me, their gaze heavy with expectation. Days passed, and my husband grew more distant, his frustration building into anger. The children avoided me, their innocence tainted by the darkness I had invited into our home. I knew I was losing them, but I couldn't pull myself away. Eleanor's story demanded to be heard. I began to write down everything I had learned, the letters, the dreams, the strange occurrences that seemed to intensify with each passing day. It was as if the house itself was urging me on, guiding me towards some terrible revelation. I no longer cared if I was losing my mind. I had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The days grew colder, the air thick with the scent of decay. Autumn had settled over the house like a shroud, its chill seeping through the old walls. I found myself drawn to the attic more frequently, my fingers numb from the cold as I sifted through the letters once again. The locket never left my side, its weight a constant reminder of Eleanor's pain. My husband's patience had worn away completely. Our conversations had become brief and mechanical, our arguments sharp and unresolved. He accused me of abandoning our family, of losing myself to a madness he couldn't understand. I couldn't explain the pull I felt, the way Eleanor's words seemed to call out to me, urging me to uncover the truth. The children avoided me. Their laughter had grown brittle, their smiles forced. I could feel their fear, their uncertainty. They had once seen the house as a playground, a castle ripe for exploration. Now it was something darker, its shadows stretching longer with each passing day. I had begun to keep a journal, recording everything I discovered. I wrote down Eleanor's words, her anguish, her desperation. I wrote about the dreams, the sensation of being watched, the footsteps that echoed through the house at night. I documented the feeling of cold fingers brushing against my skin, the whisper of a voice just beyond the edge of hearing. Eleanor's story had grown clearer. Her love for Samuel had turned bitter when he betrayed her trust. She had poured her anger into those letters, her pain seeping into the very fabric of the house. But there was something more, something I hadn't yet uncovered. The letters hinted at a final act of retribution, a plan left unfinished. I became obsessed with finding the missing pieces. I tore through old books and documents, searching for any mention of Eleanor or her family. The house's history was tangled and obscure, its past marred by tragedy and loss. I found fragments of records, hints of scandals swept under the rug, but nothing that explained the intensity of Eleanor's pain. My nights were sleepless, my thoughts tangled and restless. I wandered the halls in darkness, my footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. The house felt alive, its presence growing stronger with each revelation. It was as if Eleanor's sorrow had seeped into the very walls, a sickness that spread through every creak and groan. One night, as I sat in the attic surrounded by Eleanor's letters, I felt a chill that went beyond the autumn air. It was a coldness that reached deep into my bones, leaving me trembling. The locket burned against my skin, its metal strangely warm despite the icy air. I reached for the locket, my fingers tracing its tarnished surface. As I opened it, the portrait of Eleanor stared back at me, her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite name. Grief, anger, longing, perhaps all of them at once. I began to speak aloud, my voice shaking. I told Eleanor that I understood her pain, that I wanted to help her find peace. I promised to uncover the truth, to give her story the ending she had been denied. The air grew heavier, the silence deepening until it was almost suffocating. I felt a pressure building, a presence pressing down on me. And then, as suddenly as it had come, the sensation vanished. The attic was still, the only sound my own ragged breathing. But something had changed. I felt a clarity I hadn't known before, a sense of purpose that cut through the fog of obsession. I knew that I was getting closer to the truth, that Eleanor's story was reaching its climax. I spent the following days piecing together the final letters, their words sharp and desperate. Eleanor's anger had grown to consume her, her desire for revenge blinding her to everything else. She had written of a plan, a way to make Samuel pay for his betrayal. But the details were unclear, fragmented by time and decay. I grew reckless in my search, tearing through the house in a frenzy. My husband avoided me, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and pity. The children clung to him, their fear of me now evident. I could feel them slipping away, my own family lost to the madness I had embraced. But I couldn't stop. I was too close. Eleanor's story had entwined itself with my own, her pain bleeding into my life. I had to see it through. I had to uncover the truth no matter the cost. And then, one night, I found the final letter. The final letter was buried beneath a layer of dust, tucked away in the corner of the attic where the light barely reached. My hands trembled as I unfolded the paper, its edges brittle and stained with age. The ink had faded, but the words remained legible, their intensity undiminished by time. Eleanor's anger had reached a fever pitch. She spoke of betrayal, of lies layered upon lies until they crushed her under their weight. Her love for Samuel had been absolute, her devotion unwavering. But he had shattered that love, leaving her with nothing but rage. I read her words aloud, my voice echoing through the attic. As I spoke, the air grew colder, the silence deepening until it felt almost tangible. Eleanor's pain poured from the letter, her fury a force that seemed to pulse through the very walls of the house. She had made a plan. It was desperate, reckless, born from a grief so profound it twisted her mind. She intended to confront Samuel, to make him feel the pain he had inflicted upon her. Her words hinted at something dark, a final act meant to seal her revenge. But the letter ended abruptly, the last line trailing off into nothingness. Whatever she had planned, whatever vengeance she had sought, it remained unfinished. And I could feel the weight of that unfinished act pressing down upon me. I closed my eyes, the letter clutched in my hands. I could almost hear her voice, a whisper that trembled through the air. She wanted me to finish what she had started, to bring her story to its rightful conclusion. I had become so entangled in her pain that I could no longer distinguish her anguish from my own. The line between the past and the present had blurred, the house itself conspiring to draw me deeper into its darkness. I had to find out what happened to Eleanor. I had to bring her peace. In the days that followed, I found myself consumed by my quest. I scoured every inch of the house, searching for any clue that might reveal the truth. My husband's frustration had turned to anger, his patience shattered by my obsession. He threatened to leave, to take the children and abandon me to the madness I had embraced. But even his words couldn't reach me. I was lost, my mind fixated on Eleanor's final letter and the mystery it left behind. The house had become my world, its shadows my only companions. I no longer cared about the life I was destroying, only the story I was desperate to uncover. One night, as I sat alone in the attic, I began to speak to Eleanor. I told her I understood her pain, that I wanted to help her find peace. I poured my own grief and frustration into the words, hoping she could hear me, hoping she would guide me to the answers I sought. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in around me. I felt a presence, something beyond mere imagination. It was as if Eleanor herself was standing beside me, her sorrow entwined with my own. I spent hours speaking into the silence, my voice cracking from exhaustion. I told Eleanor I would find out what happened, that I would bring her story to light. I made a promise, one I knew I could not break. In the days that followed, my search grew even more frantic. I tore through the house with a desperation that bordered on madness. I found myself neglecting everything else, my thoughts consumed by Eleanor's final letter and the questions it left unanswered. Then, on a stormy afternoon, I discovered something that changed everything. Behind a loose panel in the library, I found a hidden compartment. Inside was a small book, its cover worn and faded. It was Eleanor's journal, a record of her descent into madness. I opened the journal, my hands trembling. The pages were filled with her anguish, her fury, her obsession with revenge. But they also held something else. Fragments of hope, glimpses of the woman she had once been before betrayal had twisted her soul. As I read, I began to understand the truth. Eleanor's story was not just one of vengeance, but of longing. She had been searching for something more than retribution. She had been searching for peace. And I realized then that my own obsession mirrored hers. I had allowed the darkness of the house to consume me, just as it had consumed her. But I wasn't ready to let go. Not yet. There was still something I needed to uncover, something that would finally bring closure to Eleanor's story. The journal held the key. I was certain of it. The journal became my guide. Its pages were filled with Eleanor's thoughts, her descent into anger and grief documented with meticulous care. But beyond her pain, I saw flashes of something gentler, memories of happiness that had been twisted by betrayal. I read her words for hours, my fingers trembling as I traced the ink-stained lines. Eleanor had been meticulous, her writing a desperate attempt to make sense of the darkness that had overtaken her. She had loved Samuel with a fierceness that frightened her, a devotion that left her vulnerable to the wounds he inflicted. But as her anger grew, so did her obsession. The journal was both a confession and a plea, a testament to her unraveling mind. She had planned her revenge with a clarity that chilled me, her words sharp and deliberate. The final entries were fragmented, her thoughts scattered and wild. She spoke of visions, of shadows that whispered in the night. She described the feeling of being watched, of a presence that haunted her every step. Her writing grew frantic, her sentences disjointed. I found myself consumed by her words, my own mind blurring the line between her pain and mine. I began to dream of her more frequently, her presence a constant shadow in my thoughts. Her eyes would meet mine across the darkness, her expression unreadable. Days turned into weeks, and my obsession deepened. The journal was my only solace, its pages a connection to something that felt both foreign and familiar. I had become so entwined with Eleanor's story that I could no longer separate her pain from my own. My husband's frustration had turned to resignation. He no longer tried to reach me, his voice a distant echo that I could barely comprehend. The children avoided me, their faces pale and fearful. I had become a stranger to them, my world consumed by a history that was not my own. But I couldn't stop. The journal had hinted at something unfinished, a final act that Eleanor had never completed. I felt her desperation pulsing through the words, a need for closure that echoed my own. I began to spend entire nights in the attic, my fingers stained with ink as I scribbled down my own thoughts, my own confusion. I wrote about the way the house seemed to breathe around me, its presence a constant weight pressing down on my chest. I wrote about the whispers that crept through the darkness, the feeling of cold fingers brushing against my skin. One night, as a storm raged outside, I made a discovery. The journal had mentioned a room, a place Eleanor had returned to again and again in her final days. It was described in vague terms, its location hinted at but never revealed. Driven by a madness I could no longer control, I tore through the house, searching for the hidden space Eleanor had described. My hands bled from tearing away old wallpaper, my fingers raw from prying open long-sealed doors. And then I found it, a small room, concealed behind a panel in the cellar. The air was thick with dust, the darkness oppressive. But as I stepped inside, I felt a chill that cut through me like a knife. The room was barren, its walls bare and crumbling. But on the floor lay a single piece of paper, yellowed with age. I knelt down, my fingers trembling as I picked it up. It was a letter, one Eleanor had written in the final days of her life. Her words were frantic, desperate, a last plea for someone to understand her pain. She spoke of betrayal, of loss, of a darkness that had consumed her. But there was something else, a confession. She had planned to confront Samuel, to force him to acknowledge the hurt he had caused. But instead, she had been consumed by her own anger, her own need for revenge. The letter ended with a single sentence, a plea for forgiveness, not from Samuel but from herself. I sat there in the darkness, the letter clutched in my hands. I could feel Eleanor's presence more acutely than ever before, her sorrow and regret mingling with my own. The realization hit me like a blow. Eleanor had never found peace because she had never forgiven herself. Her rage had twisted her, her need for revenge blinding her to the possibility of healing. I rose to my feet, the letter still in my hand. I knew what I had to do. The journal, the letters, the locket. They were all pieces of a puzzle that had been left unfinished. And it was up to me to bring closure to Eleanor's story. But as I left the cellar, my resolve only strengthened. I couldn't help but wonder if it was already too late. I emerged from the cellar with the letter clutched in my hand, my mind reeling from the discovery. Eleanor's final words haunted me, their desperation echoing through my thoughts. I could feel her presence more acutely than ever, her pain intertwined with my own. I spent the following days locked away in the attic, poring over the letters and the journal with a renewed intensity. I searched for any hint, any clue that might explain what Eleanor had tried to achieve. I needed to understand her, to grasp the depth of her suffering. But more than that, I needed to help her find peace. Her anguish had seeped into the house, tainting everything it touched. I could feel it in the air, the heaviness that pressed down on me like a weight. My husband had given up on trying to reach me. He moved through the house like a ghost, his presence fleeting and distant. The children had grown silent, their eyes filled with a sadness that cut through me like a blade. I knew I was failing them, abandoning them to chase after shadows. But I couldn't stop. I had come too far, and Eleanor's pain had become my own. Her story demanded resolution, and I was determined to find it. One night, as I sat alone in the attic, I began to speak aloud. I spoke to Eleanor, my voice trembling with emotion. I told her that I understood her pain, that I wanted to help her find the peace she had been denied. The air grew colder, the darkness deepening until it felt almost tangible. I felt a presence, something beyond mere imagination. It was as if Eleanor herself was standing beside me, her sorrow intertwined with my own. I told her I would help her, that I would uncover the truth and bring closure to her story. I promised her that I would not rest until she found the peace she had been searching for. But even as I made that promise, I felt a creeping sense of dread. The house had taken hold of me, its darkness bleeding into my thoughts. I had become obsessed, my own pain tangled with Eleanor's until I could no longer separate them. I began to dream of her more frequently. In my dreams, she would reach out to me, her fingers cold and trembling. Her eyes held a sadness that pierced through me, her voice a whisper that echoed in the darkness. The dreams grew more vivid, their intensity leaving me shaken and disoriented. I woke up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding as if I had been running for my life. The house felt different in the aftermath of those dreams, its presence heavier and more oppressive. I knew I was losing myself, that my obsession with Eleanor's story was consuming me. But I couldn't stop. I had to see it through, to find the answers that had eluded her in life. I spent hours researching the history of the house, combing through old documents and records. I found fragments of information, pieces of a puzzle that refused to fit together. There were mentions of scandals, of betrayals and tragedies that had left their mark on the house, but nothing that explained the depth of Eleanor's pain. I began to wonder if the house itself was feeding on her sorrow, amplifying her anguish until it became something monstrous. I could feel it seeping into me, twisting my thoughts until I no longer recognized myself. The children had grown afraid of me, their eyes wide and fearful whenever I approached. My husband's anger had turned to indifference, his presence nothing more than a shadow. I had pushed them away, consumed by a past that refused to stay buried. But I couldn't abandon Eleanor. Her story had become mine, her pain my own. I needed to find the truth, to bring closure to the wounds that had festered for so long. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness settled over the house, I made a decision. I would confront Eleanor's pain head-on, to bring her story to its rightful end. I gathered the letters, the journal, and the locket, arranging them carefully on the attic floor. I knelt before them, my hands trembling as I spoke aloud. I told Eleanor that I understood her suffering, that I felt the weight of her pain. I acknowledged her anger, her grief, her desperation. And then, I offered her something she had never received: forgiveness. I whispered the words into the darkness, my voice thick with emotion. I told her that it was time to let go, to release the pain that had consumed her for so long. I told her that I would carry her story forward, that I would remember her, but that her suffering needed to end. The air grew colder, the darkness pressing in around me. But I felt a shift, a subtle change in the atmosphere. It was as if something had been lifted, a weight that had pressed down on the house finally released. I sat there for hours, my hands clasped together as if in prayer. I didn't know if Eleanor had heard me, if my words had reached her across the veil of time. But I felt a sense of peace, a quietness that I hadn't known in months. For the first time, I allowed myself to hope. The days that followed felt different. The air in the house was lighter. The oppressive heaviness that had plagued me for so long now eased. I could still feel Eleanor's presence, but it was no longer a weight pressing down on me. Instead, it was something gentler, a quiet echo that drifted through the rooms like a faint melody. I found myself drawn back to the attic, not out of desperation or fear, but out of something resembling compassion. I continued to sort through the letters and the journal, piecing together the fragments of Eleanor's life. Her pain was still there, but it no longer felt overwhelming. Felt understood. My husband noticed the change in me. He spoke cautiously, his voice edged with hope but guarded by doubt. I could see the weariness in his eyes, the strain my obsession had placed on him. The children were still distant, their laughter muted, their smiles uncertain. But they no longer looked at me with fear. I tried to rebuild what I had nearly destroyed. I spent time with my children, listening to their stories, their dreams. I apologized to my husband, acknowledging the madness I had allowed to consume me. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. But even as I tried to mend the rifts I had created, I couldn't let go of Eleanor's story. I felt compelled to finish what I had begun, to ensure that her pain was truly put to rest. I returned to the journal, reading her words with a clarity I hadn't possessed before. Eleanor's final entries spoke of forgiveness, of her struggle to let go of the hatred that had consumed her. She had realized, too late, that her desire for revenge had only deepened her wounds. Her anger had turned inward, poisoning her own heart. I felt a deep sorrow for her, a grief that went beyond her betrayal and loss. She had been trapped by her own pain, her own inability to release the past, and I had nearly followed the same path. I began to write my own thoughts, recording the journey I had taken through Eleanor's pain. I wrote about the house, its darkness and its beauty. I wrote about the way it had drawn me in, how it had mirrored my own struggles and fears. Writing became a form of healing, a way to release the weight I had carried for so long. I poured my emotions onto the page, my words mingling with Eleanor's until they became inseparable. Her story had become mine, but I was determined to give it a different ending. One evening, as the sky turned golden with the setting sun, I took the letters, the journal, and the locket to the garden. I had spent so many hours confined within the house, tangled in its shadows. I needed to bring Eleanor's pain into the light. I sat on the grass, the cool earth beneath me, and began to speak. I told Eleanor that her story had been heard, that her pain had not been forgotten. I acknowledged her suffering, her grief, her anger, and I told her that it was time to let go. I placed the letters and the journal in a metal box, sealing them away as a gesture of release. I buried the box beneath the oldest tree in the garden, its roots entwined with the earth like veins. I placed the locket on top, a final offering of peace. As I pressed the soil over the box, I felt a quietness settle over me. It wasn't the sudden, dramatic release I had expected. It was something softer, more subtle, a sense of acceptance, of understanding. The house felt different after that night. Its shadows no longer loomed over me, its presence no longer heavy with grief. I could walk through the rooms without feeling the cold press of Eleanor's pain. I began to rebuild my life, to repair the damage I had caused. My husband and I spoke more openly, our conversations no longer clouded by resentment. The children returned to their laughter, their joy infectious and pure. But even as I embraced this new beginning, I knew that Eleanor's story would always be a part of me. Her pain had taught me something valuable, something that went beyond mere understanding. It had shown me the importance of letting go, of releasing the burdens that threatened to consume us. Weeks passed, and the house grew warmer, its light spilling through the windows like liquid gold. The garden flourished, the air rich with the scent of flowers and earth. I no longer felt the need to return to the attic, to sift through the remnants of Eleanor's pain. But every so often, I would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow passing through the hallways, a faint whisper carried on the breeze. It no longer frightened me. Instead, it felt like a farewell. Eleanor's presence had faded, her pain finally laid to rest. But her memory remained, woven into the fabric of the house like threads of silver. And as I moved forward, I carried her story with me, not as a burden, but as a gift. As the weeks turned into months, the house grew more familiar, its once foreboding presence softened by time and understanding. My obsession with Eleanor's story had subsided, replaced by a quiet sense of acceptance. The shadows that had haunted me no longer clung to the walls. Instead, they seemed to melt away in the light. The children returned to their joyful selves, their laughter echoing through the rooms like music. They played in the garden, their games full of life and innocence. My husband and I began to rebuild what had nearly been lost, our conversations deeper and more honest than they had ever been before. But even as I moved forward, I couldn't forget the journey I had taken. Eleanor's pain had left a mark on me, one that wouldn't simply fade with time. I found myself drawn to the garden, to the spot where I had buried her letters and journal. It had become a place of quiet reflection, a sanctuary where I could feel her presence without fear. I planted flowers above the buried box, their blossoms vibrant and fragrant. Felt like a tribute, a way to honor her memory. As the flowers grew, their roots entwined with the earth, I felt a sense of peace settle over me. But peace is rarely without interruption. One afternoon, as I tended to the garden, I noticed something unusual. The soil above the buried box had been disturbed, the flowers uprooted and scattered. My first thought was that the children had been playing too roughly, their curiosity leading them to dig where they shouldn't. But when I asked them, their expressions were puzzled, their innocence clear. They hadn't touched the flowers, hadn't even ventured near that part of the garden. My husband dismissed it as the work of animals or weather, but I felt a chill creep down my spine. I tried to ignore the disturbance, to brush it off as mere coincidence. But a lingering unease settled over me, a feeling that something had shifted. I couldn't shake the sense that Eleanor's story was not yet finished. Days later, I found the locket resting on my bedside table. The same locket I had buried beneath the tree, sealed away along with the letters and journal. Its tarnished surface gleamed softly in the morning light, its presence both familiar and unsettling. I questioned my husband, the children, anyone who might have found it and placed it there. But no one claimed responsibility. They looked at me with concern, their worry palpable. My husband's patience had grown, but his eyes still held traces of fear whenever I mentioned Eleanor's name. I tried to dismiss the incident, to convince myself that I had simply forgotten to bury the locket. But deep down, I knew better. Something was calling me back, a voice that refused to be silenced. I began to dream of Eleanor again. This time, her presence was not angry or sorrowful. It was pleading, her expression filled with something I could only describe as desperation. Her lips moved, but her voice remained unheard, her message locked away within the confines of my dreams. The house felt different once more, its air thick with tension. I could feel Eleanor's presence pressing down on me, her story unraveling in ways I couldn't yet comprehend. I returned to the attic, searching through the scattered papers for something I might have missed. It was then that I discovered a page I had overlooked. A final entry from Eleanor's journal, its ink faded and fragile. Her words spoke of regret, of a truth she had hidden away even from herself. She had been so consumed by her anger that she had failed to see something vital, something that had haunted her long after her death. Eleanor had not been betrayed by Samuel, at least not in the way she had believed. His actions, though hurtful, had been driven by his own pain, his own desperate need for freedom. Their love had become a prison, a bond twisted by jealousy and possessiveness. The realization struck me like a blow. Eleanor's anger had been misplaced, her hatred born from a misunderstanding that had festered into something monstrous. She had clung to her pain, refusing to see the truth that might have brought her peace. And now that truth had become my own. I held the locket in my hands, its weight both familiar and foreign. I could feel Eleanor's presence surrounding me, her desperation mingling with my own confusion. She wanted me to understand, to see the truth she had been blinded to. But even as I tried to make sense of her words, I felt the darkness creeping back in. The house had not released me, not entirely. Its shadows still clung to the corners of my mind, their whispers growing louder with each passing day. I knew I had to uncover the final piece of Eleanor's story. Only then could I hope to free us both. The truth unraveled itself slowly, like a thread pulled free from tangled fabric. Eleanor's pain had been genuine, her grief a wound that had festered over time. But it was not Samuel's betrayal that had destroyed her. It was her own refusal to let go of the past, to release the anger that had twisted her mind. I spent days lost in thought, piecing together the fragments of Eleanor's story. Her obsession had mirrored my own, her pain reflected in the darkness I had allowed to consume me. I understood her desperation, her need to cling to the memory of what she had lost. But understanding was not enough. I needed to do more. I needed to give her the peace she had been denied. I returned to the garden, the locket clutched tightly in my hand. The flowers I had planted were blooming once more, their petals vibrant and alive. It was a stark contrast to the decay I had felt within the house, a reminder that life could still flourish despite the darkness. I knelt by the tree where I had buried the journal and letters. My fingers dug into the earth, the soil cool and damp beneath my skin. I unearthed the metal box, its surface tarnished but intact. I opened it, my breath catching as I looked upon Eleanor's words once more. The journal felt heavier than before, its pages thick with sorrow. But there was something else there, something I had not noticed before. A note tucked between the final pages, written in a hand that trembled with regret. Eleanor had realized the truth before her death. She had understood that her anger had been misplaced, that her pain had been self-inflicted as much as it had been caused by Samuel's actions. Her final words were a plea for forgiveness, not from Samuel, but from herself. I held the note in my hands, my own tears falling onto the faded paper. Eleanor's pain had been real, but her inability to release it had been her true undoing. And I had nearly followed the same path. I placed the note, the journal, and the locket back into the box. But this time I did not bury them. Instead, I carried them with me to the attic, the place where her pain had first been revealed to me. I arranged the items carefully, placing the locket atop the journal like a crown. I spoke aloud, my voice trembling but steady. I told Eleanor that her pain had been acknowledged, her story heard. I told her that forgiveness was not something granted by others, but something found within herself. I felt the air shift around me, a gentle breeze stirring the dust that clung to the rafters. It was not the sudden release I had expected, but a quiet sense of acceptance, as if Eleanor's spirit had finally found peace. The house grew warmer in the days that followed, its shadows no longer oppressive. The children played freely once more, their laughter unburdened by the darkness that had plagued our home. My husband and I spoke openly, our words no longer tainted by resentment. But I would never forget Eleanor's story. Her pain had taught me something valuable, something I had needed to learn. The importance of letting go, of releasing the anger that threatened to consume me. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I stood in the garden and looked toward the attic window. I felt a presence there, but it was no longer heavy or sorrowful. It was light, like a memory that had finally been allowed to rest. I knew then that Eleanor was gone, her spirit freed from the pain that had bound her to this place. And I too was free. The house remained ours, but it no longer felt haunted. It was simply a place filled with history, with stories both joyful and sorrowful. And I had become part of that history, my own pain woven into the fabric of its walls. I found myself writing again, not from obsession but from a desire to share what I had learned. I wrote Eleanor's story, not as a tale of horror but as one of healing and redemption. I poured my heart into the words, hoping that they might reach someone who needed them. And as I wrote, I felt a quietness settle over me. The darkness had passed, replaced by something gentler, something true. Eleanor's secrets had been laid to rest, and so had mine. If you enjoyed this story, please don't forget to leave a comment and share your thoughts. It will help the channel grow and inspire me to create more interesting stories for you. I also want to apologize for any mistakes in the text, as the narration is done using artificial intelligence. If you notice any inaccuracies or areas that need improvement, please mention them in the comments. This will help make the content even better. Thank you for watching and for your support.